This is episode 13 of the Relentless Man podcast. Learning. Hi, and welcome to the Relentless Man podcast. I'm your host, modjaiso, and my goal is to help man die empty, to make sure that you die having used up every ounce of potential that is trapped within you. However, to help you die empty, I will have to be very raw and brutally honest with you. So if you're easily offended, stop listening. If you're easily triggered, stop listening. If you can't handle explicit language, stop listening. If you are fragile, stop listening. Otherwise, let's dig in. In this episode, we are going to talk about learning. But before we begin talking about learning, it's important that I urge you not to take what I say as gospel or to imitate and implement every idea I give without thinking about it for yourself. Rather, what I recommend is that you apply your own thinking, that you turn on your own brain, and that every decision and action that you take is a consequence of your own thinking and your own decision-making process. Remember, do not be a follower, be a student. We are going to talk about learning. In particular, we'll talk about why learning is vital for your success. We'll also talk about what learning actually is. So let's begin by thinking about why learning is vital for your success. If you're a member of the Relentless community, then it means that you're someone whose primary ambition is to die empty, to use up all the potential that is trapped within you. By definition, this means that you're wildly ambitious, that there are things right now that you wish you were able to do, but that you actually are not able to do. Let's get more specific with an actual example. Suppose that you realize that the thing that's holding you back from dying empty is the fact that you don't have great relationships. All the relationships you have are actually shitty. Of course, there are many reasons why your relationships wouldn't work, but let's suppose that the main reasons why your relationships don't work is the fact that the first reason is that you don't really listen. That is, when you talk to people, it's not really a dialogue, it's usually a monologue. And if the other person actually gets a chance to speak, you barely pay attention to what they have to say. So in this case, we say that one of the core problems that you're facing is the fact that you don't know how to listen. Let's say that the second problem that's stopping you from having great relationships is the fact that you're not able to talk about your feelings and emotions effectively. That is, you're not a good communicator. Now, this is another thing that's stopping you from having great relationships. So what we can conclude here is that there are really two things holding you back. The fact that you don't listen effectively and the fact that you don't communicate well. So what do listening and communicating have in common? Both of those things are skills. And what's so exciting about skills? Well, the thing that's most exciting about skills is that skills can be learned. So really, the thing that's stopping you from dying empty, the thing that's stopping you from having great relationships is the fact that you haven't learned how to communicate effectively. You also haven't learned how to listen effectively. So really, the root cause of your problems is learning. Now, this fact that if you expand your skill set and learn skills, you're going to be able to do things that at the moment you cannot do is not just restricted to having great relationships. It applies to virtually anything you want to accomplish. If there is anything you want to do that at the moment you're not able to do, well, I can almost guarantee you that there is a skill set that if you learned that skill set, you'll be able to do whatever it is that you're trying to do. Are you trying to be a great basketball player? There's a skill set for that. If you learn the skills, you'll be a great basketball player. Do you want to be a great dancer? There's a skill set for that. If you learn that skill set, you'll be a great dancer. Do you want to be a great scientist? There's a skill set for that. If you learn that skill set, you'll be a great scientist. Virtually anything you're trying to do, if there is anything right now that you really need to do in order to realize your potential, but at the moment you're not able to do it, whatever that thing is, I can almost guarantee you there is a skill set for that. If you learn that skill set, you'll be able to do that thing. So really the only thing that's holding you back from doing things you can't do right now is the fact that you haven't learned a certain skill set. So learning is not only important for your success, it's actually fundamental and vital for your success as a relentless man. You actually will not be able, I really can't envision how you'll be able to accomplish great things, to die empty, if you don't learn how to learn. Now that we've established why learning is vital and fundamental for your success, let's think about what learning actually is. It happens often that we find ourselves in situations where we have some skill or some fact or some idea or concept, and we are not sure whether we've learned it or not. And usually this manifests in one of two ways. Either you have someone who has learned a skill, but they have convinced themselves that they haven't learned it, in which case the person suffers from underestimating themselves. Let's look at a concrete example. Let's suppose that you've been practicing how to speak in public, and you actually have mastered and you're a good public speaker. You've learned how to speak in public. But let's say that for some reason you don't know that you've learned how to speak in public. So you basically have convinced yourself that you're not able to speak in public when in fact you already know how to do that. What would happen in this case is you'll actually go out there and then maybe you're put to speak in public. And instead of actually making a great public speech that you're capable of, you'll end up making a mediocre speech. Not because you're not able to or you don't know how to speak in public, but because you've somehow convinced yourself that you're not good at public speaking when in fact you are. That is, you've convinced yourself that you haven't learned something that you've actually learned. So here you end up underestimating yourself and performing way below your potential. So really it's fundamental that you don't underestimate yourself and think that you haven't learned something when in fact you've learned it. The other way in which this problem manifests itself is if you actually haven't learned something, but you convince yourself that you actually know how to do that thing. This is a problem because it could lead to great embarrassment and possibly very horrible consequences. Let's suppose that you're a surgeon and let's say you're performing some heart procedure and you convince yourself, you think you actually know how to perform this heart transplant or procedure, but you actually do not know how to do this. What are the consequences of this? Well, maybe you'll find yourself on the operating table and you realize then that you actually really don't know how to do this operation. Obviously, this could lead to catastrophic consequences because it's possible that you could cause serious harm, if not death, to the patient. Here, what happened? You overestimated yourself. You thought you had learned how to do an operation when in fact you hadn't. Here you had the problem of thinking you've learned how to do something when in fact you haven't. So it turns out it's really important to know whether or not you've learned a certain idea or concept or skill. Because if you've learned it, then you could dedicate your time towards doing something else. And if you haven't learned it, then you can focus more until you've learned the given idea or concept or skill. So let's think about then what learning actually is. And in this process, we'll figure out a criterion you can use to decide whether or not you've learned something. I define learning to be the process of taking in new information, internalizing that new information, and applying the new information to novel contexts. The acronym I like to use for this is TIA. T-I-A. If you're a Spanish speaker, then TIA will actually be more memorable for you. The T stands for taking in new information. I stands for internalizing that new information. And A stands for applying the new information to novel situations. Let's now think about what it means to take in information. What does it mean when we say take in new information? We'll do it looking at a few examples. Suppose that you're a student in a classroom and there's a professor and the professor is teaching you addition. Now we are going to suppose that you've actually never done any addition in your life before. So this is genuinely new information for you. What would it mean to take in information under that situation? Well, if you're in the classroom learning addition, well, you might listen to what the professor is saying. So in this case, the information gets to your brain through listening. Or you might watch what's going on the board when the professor is writing, and the information gets into your brain through vision. Or it might be a combination of listening and looking and vision. So ultimately, when we're talking about taking in information here, we're talking about how the information is getting into your brain. Let's look at a slightly, seemingly different example, but really the same in spirit. Let's say you've never ridden a bicycle before. So a bike and riding a bike is genuinely a new activity for you. You don't really understand how it works. What would it mean to take in information under that situation? What would mean there is, let's say you got on the bike and you shifted your weight too much to the left, and then you're gonna fall off. If you fall off the bike, you'll feel the pain, and that pain will send information to your brain, letting you know that when you shift your weight too much to the left, you fall off the bike. Let's say you get back on the bike and you switch your weight too much to the right. Now you fall to the right. Now your brain figures out, oh my, every time I shift my weight to the right, I end up falling and feeling pain. And that means that it's probably a good idea for me to center my weight in the bike. I don't want to be too much to the left or too much to the right, too much to the back or too much in front. All this information as a result of you feeling the pain and the sensations as you try to ride the bike, all that information is sent to your brain. Your brain takes in that information. So if we're going to be very abstract, what we're really saying here is that taking in information is a part of the learning process where the new information leaves the external environment and actually enters into your brain, usually through some interface. Maybe it will be your skin by feeling it, or through your eyes or ears, or through your nose, or through tasting it somehow, or basically a mixture of all of these senses. So it's very clear that taking in new information is a vital part of the learning process. Suppose you, let's say, didn't do that. Let's say you're in class and you're not focusing. So you're back in class and the professor is teaching math and is teaching you addition, but you're not focusing. So maybe you're not listening to what the professor is saying, or you're not really looking at the board. Well, if you're not doing that, if you're not focusing, then the information never gets into your brain. If the information never gets into your brain, how the heck will you ever learn how to add or whatever it is that the professor is teaching? So you see, it's very clear that taking in information is important, because if you don't take in information, if the information never gets into your brain, you never really learn. However, it's important to know that while taking in information is vital to the learning process, taking in information doesn't mean that you've learned the material. Just because you sit down in the classroom and focus and listen to the professor and look at what they're doing and take notes doesn't mean you've learned what addition is. Just because you fell off the bike and felt the pain and learned about what happens when you position your body in different ways doesn't mean you've learned how to ride a bike. You've just taken in information. Because learning how to ride a bike or learning how to do any activity or learning any concept really implies a certain level of independence. If you need to rely on people or objects or sources or notes in order to do something, then that's a sure sign that you haven't really learned that thing. And this leads us to our next part of the learning process. This is the next letter in our acronym tier, and that is internalization. The next step in the learning process is internalization. What do we really mean by that? Let's look at an example. Let's suppose that we're back in the classroom and you're learning addition. What would it mean to internalize the addition? What that would mean is you reach a point where you're able to do the addition and the sums that the professor is giving you without needing to refer to the professor, without needing the professor's help, without needing extra notes or anything external. That is, the addition and the concept is within you. You can do it yourself, and you do not need anything external in order to access and use the concept of addition. When addition becomes internal to you in that way, we say you've internalized addition. Let's look at our example of the bike situation. What would it mean to internalize how the bike works. What that would mean is you reach a point where you no longer need to think about where to put your weight, whether to shift it to the left or to the right, what happens when you move the handlebars of the bike, the handle of the bike to the left or the right, or what happens when you press the right brake or the left brake. When you reach a point where you no longer need to think about those details, and you don't need a coach or a trainer or anything external, anyone external to tell you what's going to happen when you do something on a bike, when you reach that point, we say you've internalized how the bike works. So if you're going to be abstract, would say internalization is the process where the new information that you're trying to learn is so much a part of you that you no longer need external sources or stimuli in order to access and use that information. So clearly internalization is a very important part of the learning process, because if you don't internalize information, then it means you're really depending on external things, maybe a professor, a teacher, or your notes in order to do the activity. And if you're doing that, then it really doesn't inspire confidence. In fact, it's a sure sign that you haven't really learned how to perform the activity, because if you'd learned the new information, then you wouldn't need to refer to anything external. While internalization, however, is vital to the learning process, it is still not proof that you've learned something, because there's another step, another part of learning. If you're only able to use what you've learned in the context in which you've learned it, then you haven't really learned the material. The true test of whether you've learned new information is if you can apply it to new situations. And that takes us to the last letter in our acronym TIA. T was taking in new information, I was internalizing that information, and A stands for application, applying the new information to novel contexts. What does that mean exactly? Let's think about our student example again. You're in the classroom, the professor is teaching you addition. What would it mean to apply the concept of addition to novel situations? Now, it's very likely that when the professor was teaching you how to add, he taught you how to add under certain conditions. Maybe he taught you how to add numbers from 0 to 9. Now, just because you're able to add numbers from 0 to 9 doesn't mean you've learned addition. The true test of whether you've learned addition is if you can get that concept of adding numbers from 0 to 9 and see if you can add numbers between 2,000 and 3,000. Numbers like 1 billion and 1 trillion. If you're able to add numbers that are different from the numbers that the professor restricted you to, then that's a sure sign that you understand and have learned what addition means, because you're able to use it in a different context. If, let's say, you looked at your finances and somehow were able to connect your finances to the concept of addition, then we'd say you really understand addition, because you've been able to apply addition to this context of finances that is really different from the context in the classroom in which you learned it. If we look at the bike example, what does it really mean to say that? What does it mean to apply the information and knowledge of how the bike works to novel situations? Well, if you learned how to ride, if you've internalized how the bike works, it's likely that you did that under certain conditions. It might be that you are riding on a flat surface and that's how you worked. Just because you're able to ride on a flat surface and you don't need to think about where to shift your weight, how to move the handles of the bike, doesn't mean you've learned how the bicycle works. A true test of whether you've learned how the bicycle works is if you can use the bicycle in a new context. For instance, if we could get you to ride the bike on an incline, let's say downhill, going at really fast speed. If you're still able to control the bike, use the brakes effectively, and you're comfortable and you're not falling off, that is a sure sign that you really understand how the bike works. In that case, would say you've learned how the bike works. Or maybe if we made you ride uphill instead, and you're able to ride comfortably without any trouble, and you're able to control the brakes and everything, then that's a sign that you've learned how to ride, because you've been able to take the principles of how the bike functions and you've been able to use them under different circumstances. Circumstances that are different from the circumstances in which you learned how to ride the bike. So if you're going to be abstract, what we're saying here is that applying the new information to novel contexts really refers to the fact that whenever you're trying to learn something, usually learn about it in a given context. If you're able to take that information, the new information, out of the context in which you learned it, apply it to a different context, successfully apply that information to a new context, then that is really proof that you've learned the new information. And that's what it means to apply the new information to novel contexts. So that really is what learning is. It's TIA, T-I-A, taking in new information. That refers to the process where the information leaves the external world and gets into your brain, usually through some sort of interface, maybe your hands or your eyes or your skin or some mixture of them. The other letter is I. It stands for internalization. This is the process by which you get the new information and make it so much a part of yourself that you no longer need to rely on people or external sources in order to access and use this information. The third step in the learning process is the A, T-I-A. The A stands for application to novel contexts. The true test of whether you've learned something is if you can get that information and apply it in a context that is completely different from the context in which you learned the new information. That is a sure sign that you've learned the new information. So now you have all the tools at your disposal to decide whether or not you've learned something. You no longer need to be confused about whether you've learned a given idea or concept. All you'll have to do is to check if you can apply that idea to a novel situation. Let's say you've been trying to control your emotions and you're wondering if you've really learned how to control your emotions. Well, if you learned how to control your emotions, let's say if you learned how to be calm in a calm situation, maybe relaxing at the beach in a very zen kind of environment, then a true test of whether you know how to control your emotions is if, let's say we transferred you from the beach and took you to a rough environment where people are shouting and screaming and trying to punch you, and the situation is very chaotic. If you're still able to remain calm under those conditions, then that will be a sure sign that you've learned how to control your emotions. So that's really what it is if you're trying to figure out whether you've learned something or not, see if you can apply that new information to a novel context. And that will tell you whether or not you've learned the new information. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you have an obstacle that is holding you back and stopping you from dying empty, please email me and let me know about this obstacle. If you have any questions, queries, declarations, or for some reason need to urgently get into contact with me, please email me as well. My email is in the episode description. Thank you once again for listening, and bye.